what a crazy title, right? I'm talking about Germantown, but I started out with a battlefield tour. Well, it's rare that in the middle of a campaign somebody can do a battlefield tour. It was one of those interesting discoveries I made, and I'm going to talk about that as I lead into the Battle of Germantown itself. Germantown, as you guys probably know, is a is one of Georgia's several losses in the Philadelphia campaign of 1777. But I'm gonna approach this battle and look at it the way I really think it needs to be viewed, with good contemporary evidence, and hopefully you have a different way of looking at this big American defeat at Germantown. So we'll start there. Let's go with what George Washington actually looked like at that time. This is a rare image. I'd be surprised if most of you had seen this before. I won't be surprised if none of you have. It's a Charles Willson Peale image. It's the only one known of George Washington that was created in 1777. The one before that was the three-quarters length Hancock image in May of 76. And his wife commissioned this painting of him. It's actually a miniature, you could tell from the right-hand side. The sketch was drawn by Charles Willson Peale from life, with Washington sitting at the edge of the bed 1 week before the Battle of Germantown. It was touched up a week after that, and then during the Valley Forge encampment, Peale made 4 images of it, sold them for $56 a piece, a good cottage industry for him. And the only one that's known to survive is the one that's hanging in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and that's the one you see on the right. I will say it's a little unusual for Washington and during the campaign to have his hair powdered. It makes him look older in this image. He's only 45 years old, very robust man, almost 6'3", over 200 pounds. And the other thing that Peale does in his miniatures, these are worn in lockets and bracelets, is he deflates the shoulders of his subjects so that their epaulets show in the oval. So Washington was certainly more broad-shouldered than what you're seeing in the image. Otherwise, that's a very unique and rare image of Washington at that time. So I wanted to start out with that. And so this is a view of Washington that's unusual, I'm sure. And there are two views, verbal views of Washington that we've come to take in throughout the 21st century that I'm going to argue against today with good evidence again. One is that he fought a war of avoidance, a Fabian strategy in the Revolution. Well, Germantown already negates that, but I'll talk more about that a little bit later. And the other that we often hear about Washington, at least I do, is that even though he was a general that was indispensable for the American cause and won the Revolution, he tended to be a poor field commander who lost most of his battles on the battlefield. Let's wipe that one out right away. All right. Here is a list of Washington's battles in which he was in charge on the battlefield. So we're not going to count Kip's Bay or Paoli or these other contests where he wasn't present. These are the battles in which he's present, leading his troops. And I'm only going to look at tactical outcomes. Anybody can claim a strategic victory, even in tactical defeats. But in these cases, what's my version of a tactical victory? Who controls the battlefield at the end of the contest? Pretty simple in my book. Doesn't matter how many losses there are. Who controls the battlefield? Who obtained the battlefield objective? And if you take a look at Washington's battles through the course of the Revolution, I've come up with 11 battles. Now, I don't even count Yorktown, which is another great victory, of course, but that's a siege. So I'm only looking at battles. And Washington, with an upstart army that had very little experience for the most part, had a winning record against the elite British Army, a worldwide power. He's 6-5 according to my accounting. And today we're going to focus on one of those defeats. That's the one I've highlighted in red, Germantown. But let's get back to the battlefield tour. All right, I'm going to take us a month and a day after the Battle of Germantown. Washington is encamped at White Marsh. That area is about 12 road miles north of Philadelphia. William Howe, his adversary, he has control of Philadelphia since the end of September. And Washington is in his headquarters that he will be at for 6 weeks at White Marsh, but now it's only been a few days. This is, as it stands today, the George Emlyn House. This version, the lighter colored structure to the right, is the colonial house. Everything to the left of the front door is add-ons after the war. And I want you to focus on the chimney and the dormer here. I'm going to show a sketch later. Washington will be in that Emlyn house from November 2nd. And on the morning of November 5th, he's going to venture out with his staff and he's going to take a trip in no man's land, the region between the two opposing lines. And here's that sketch I'm going to show you that shows up in the 1920s book. There's that dormer and chimney again. This is the Emlyn house. And there's Washington with his staff. Now, he has a huge staff at this stage. And I don't know how many people accompanied him, but I do know one of them because he's the one that writes about what happens next. And that's this guy. This is the 1777 Peel image, a miniature, as you could tell once again. This is John Laurens. Who some of you may know from the Hamilton musical, but he's one of Washington's aides, a good friend of Hamilton. Both of them are French interpreters, which helps Washington get along with the French generals. And Lawrence has also a little special place for Washington because his father, at the very end of October, was just elevated to the president of the Continental Congress. So that's a good conduit to have the son of the president sit in Washington's staff. And that's what Lawrence does. He will write about what they do next. They will head about 5 miles south of the Emlyn house, and they will get up on the roof of one of the houses. Washington will have with him his spyglass. It's a dollar brass spyglass, and he's going to try to venture and look out 12 miles to the Delaware River, which is still a contested point around Philadelphia because the Americans are still holding on to the two bastions there, Fort Mercer and Mifflin. Here's Washington in a 1793 John Trumbull painting, and if you look in his right arm, there's that spyglass that he has on this day, November 5th, 1777. It's a warmer than usual day for November. It's a bit hazy, and Washington isn't able to get a very good look 12 miles to the river, where in the past, some of his fellow or subordinate generals had. Washington won't be afforded that luxury. But we do know the house that he stood on, and here's a 1763 sketch of it. I apologize for the blurry image. I kind of blew it up. It was in a magazine. You can see there's an observational walk on the top, on the roof, and that's where Washington and Laurens and probably a few other of his staff are up, looking southward 12 miles to the Delaware River. Why is this all important for my battlefield tour? It's the house. It all has to deal with location, location, location. Get a look at the house. The observational walk doesn't exist there anymore, but here's that house today. That house was a prominent battlefield structure. It was the home of Supreme Court Justice Benjamin Chew, and it's known as Cliveden. And that was a key featured house and the only preserved area today of the Battle of Germantown. Germantown's halfway between White Marsh and Philadelphia. And here's Washington 1 month and 1 day after the battle on top of that house. Here's the house during the battle. It's actually the cover image now of Rick Atkinson's second volume that just got released a few weeks ago. And I will say there's a little artistic license here because from the vantage point of the artist, you wouldn't be able to see the house on the day of the Battle of Germantown because there was so much fog that day and so much battle smoke that you wouldn't see the house from that vantage point. But then again, we wouldn't have a painting, would we? So it has to be a little artistic license. He took it, but it gives you an idea of the heavily contested area here. And it's very interesting because in that house is a battalion of the 40th Regiment of Foot that will be behind the American lines, which have pushed past it, and will take control of this battle. I'm going to talk more about that later. The battlefield tour is this. Washington's on top of that house 1 month and 1 day later. He couldn't see it during the battle, but he certainly can see it this day on November 5th. No doubt that they talked about this battle. And one of the reasons I have no doubt is because up on that roof with him is John Laurens. John Laurens was wounded that day trying to set fire to the house. So clearly they're going to be talking about the battle. And I have no doubt that they spent some time discussing or looking around at the areas they couldn't actually see from the vantage point of headquarters that day. So this is a very unique battlefield tour, one of the only times during the war that Washington will visit a battlefield of a past contest in which he fought. And this sets the stage for what we're going to talk about today, are an adjusted interpretation of the Battle of Germantown. The reason, by the way, the reason why he's going to be able to venture on that house a month and a day later, even though the British won that battle, is about 2 weeks after this. William Howe, the British commander, will recede with his force back to the defenses of Philadelphia, which will put Germantown in no man's land. The reason why we should get really interested in Germantown is because of these quotes. These quotes were registered within days to no more than a couple of weeks after the battle. They're all registered by the same person. That person is General Washington. He has put all of these lines about the battle into his dispatches to various recipients. He says the troops were not in the least dispirited from the outcome. He calls it rather unfortunate than injurious. Now, remember, in this battle, he took 2-1 losses. He lost 1,100 men versus 550 for Howe. Who calls a battle like that this happy opportunity? That's what George Washington calls it. And it's because of that that I got really interested in the battle, studied it a lot. It becomes a very interesting chapter in my book. And the chapter title is This Happy Opportunity. How could I turn that one down? And that really forms a good backdrop on this. Let's talk about what happened, what George Washington was looking for, and what actually happened during that battle. Germantown, in this 1777 map of the region, there's Philadelphia today, Schuylkill River, Delaware River. There's the sliver of roads 6 miles north of Philadelphia. Today, it's all incorporated into metropolitan Philadelphia, but it was its own entity back then. That's Germantown. Washington, on his battlefield tour, is just to the north of the city, and his White Marsh encampment in November is equidistant from Germantown off the page going north, as Philadelphia is to Germantown in the image that you see. So you get the idea that it's in the middle of this contested area. But on the battle day, Washington is still a little bit further north of that. He's 15 miles north of Germantown with an army of 16,500 men, which would make it larger than the third largest civilian population in the United States, which is Boston at 15,000. And Washington has planned an attack by coordinated assaults with brigades attacking on 4 different roads. So it's a very elaborate battle plan. And they're going to set out to march on this battle in the evening of October 3rd, all meet at their destinations along this area north of Germantown, where the British Army is divided, 9,000 men at Germantown, 4,000 men in Philadelphia. Washington will launch at Germantown at sunrise on October 4th. That's the plan. And to steel his men for the fight, he issues these general orders. I always like reading a part of this. Every motive that can touch the human breast calls us to the most vigorous exertions. Our dearest rights, our dearest friends, our own lives, honor, glory, and even shame urge us to the fight. And my fellow soldiers, when an opportunity presents, be firm, be brave, shew yourselves, men, and victory is yours. So Washington is preparing his men for the fight. They launch on those roads on beginning at 6 o'clock on October 3rd. Long march, folks. It took them all night to get to their destinations, and they launched the attack the next day. This is the map from my book, and it looks really, really involved. I'm not going to go over all of it. I just want to show you the attack starts at position 1, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit, and then I'll focus on the middle section later. It's a 4-hour battle that begins roughly at 6 a.m. Look at the area around number 1. That is where the Americans first hit opposing troops. It's the elite Crown forces, the 2nd Light Infantry of General Howe's force, and they are stationed near Mount Airy. And in this position, it's tough to dislodge them. They're very good red-coated troops. And Washington will repeat the ingredients of a previous success, but a daring one. This is him at Princeton on his dappled white Arabian named Blueskin. And he leads his men to victory and almost gets killed in the action by leading from the front. He does the same thing 9 months later at Germantown. And it scares the heck out of one of his subordinates, John Sullivan, who writes this: With great concern, I saw our brave commander exposing himself to the hottest fire of the enemy in such a manner that regard to my country obliged me to ride to him and beg him to retire. He, meaning Washington, to gratify me, Sullivan, and some others withdrew a small distance. So, for those familiar with the Civil War and the Overland Campaign, this is our Revolutionary War version of Lee to the rear when Robert E. Lee does the same thing at the Wilderness. Washington will drop back, let his troops assault in front, and then Washington will headquarter, actually not in the house, but this is the George Bonsall house, um, or Bonzel, and he and his men in the street about a quarter mile north of Cliveden, the Chew house, and they can't see. The fog, which has really helped to launch a surprise assault by the Americans, is now going to conspire against them after the first hour and a half of this fight. But here's what I want to show you on the next map. The Bonsall house, I believe, is position 6. Cliveden will be position 7. Here's the map. There's the Bonsall house. There's Cliveden. The Americans will all be attacking by 7 in the morning. Little later than dawn, but they're still all attacking. That includes Armstrong's Pennsylvanians down here near Vanderlyn's Mill. If you count up all these American brigades assaulting, that will be 14 brigades attacking at the same, well, 14 brigades at the same time. That's nearly 14,000 men. Washington has 2 brigades in reserve that he won't commit to the action right away. Here's my point. That's roughly 14,000 men attacking at the same time. It is without a doubt the largest largest assault on any by any force on American soil to that date. It's the largest tactical offensive coordinated throughout the American Revolution, and it won't be topped for 84 more years. Not until the second year of the Civil War will you have a larger coordinated tactical offensive on a battlefield than what you see at Germantown at 7 a.m. on October 4th. And initially it's successful, but now the fog is going to conspire against them because you can't see more than a few yards in front of you because of the soupiness nature of the fog and the battlefield smoke. So imagine how it's going to hamper you. You can hear firing to your right or left. You don't know if it's friend or foe. And look at the success that General Greene and Smallwood are having on the British right flank under Grant. They're folding it in, yet they don't get to see that awe-inspiring and elan-inspiring retreat of the redcoats in front of them, because unlike what you saw at the 2nd Light Infantry at Mount Airy, because they can't see in front of them, so they're robbed of that great battlefield spirit lifting assault, and they can't see friend or foe in front of them. Now you have those men at Cliveden, the British 40th regiment of foot, the battalion of it in the Chew house at position 7. It is now behind the American lines. Nobody knows what to do. There's arguments on both sides at the Benzel house, a quarter mile north of it. Do we let them go? Do we fire in front of them? Henry Knox, the artillerist, says you don't leave a castle in your rear. You got to suppress it. Washington will play both sides, and he will decide to attack first with one regiment, but it grows into a life of its own. Maxwell's entire New Jersey brigade assaults it. 45 casualties are inflicted right here at the steps of the house. John Lawrence is wounded trying to set fire. He's also probably at the steps of that house. And 6 cannons will be deployed against it. The noise that it's making confuses the Americans in front. Are they being enveloped in the rear? Are they getting attacked from 3 sides now? No, but they can't tell that at that stage. And now Cliveden is actually pulling American troops away with a life of its own. And with that, you have a resurgence of Crown Force troops coming in at position 9, and they will push the Americans back. Now, most histories will say that Cliveden changed the course of the battle. I don't buy into that. I'd be willing to talk about this in Q&A. I think Cliveden actually hastened the inevitable. I think after the British held, after that hard hit by those 14 assaulting brigades, that even adding another reserve brigade into the fight wouldn't have changed the outcome. And maybe Clifton spared more casualties because Washington will attack not with the notion of pushing this on to Philadelphia. He only wants to rout the Germantown force and then pull back under his own volition. How can I prove that? By this. Philadelphia shows up nowhere in his battlefield orders. That's the first point. And in the second point, and this is really interesting, Washington does not have his wagons roll with the army. They stay 15 miles in the rear. It's almost like Washington is putting a check upon himself. Don't let this get too carried away. Hit him at Germantown. If you rout him, don't chase him to Philadelphia because this third largest city in the United States now has to get back to its supply line, and they got to fall back sooner or later that day. So Washington had no designs of attacking Philadelphia. He only wanted to attack at Germantown, 6 miles north of it, pull back on his own. As it turns out, Clifton hastened the inevitable. Washington will retreat in fairly good order. He'll save all of his cannons. And if he hung out any longer, 3,000 men coming up from Philadelphia under Cornwallis would have made that outcome even worse. So why did Washington do that? Why did he attack with only the notion of hitting Philadelphia, knowing that military doctrine suggests that the offensive, you're going to take 2-to-1 casualties. It's exactly what happened. Why does he do that? Well, he obviously is trying to instill elan into his troops. He actually says that in the aftermath. And if you look at the outcome with his subordinate generals, it worked. Look at what they're saying. I'll let you read some of these on your own, but this is incredible. This is in an American defeat. This is the way they're looking at it. 2 fights. The first fight they won, watching redcoats turn their back to them, and they just hung out too long and got forced away from the battlefield. My favorite is the middle one that you see from Lieutenant Colonel William Heath. It was a grand enterprise, an inimitable plan with which nothing but its godlike author could equal. That's what he's calling Washington. Now you're looking at that, maybe rolling your eyes a little bit and saying, okay, maybe this is Heath saying this as Washington's obituary. He died in December of 1799. Maybe Heath wrote this in 1800. No, he wrote this on October 12th, just a week after the battle. So this is the way, to a man, the officers and men are treating that battle loss. They are treating it as a victory, that they had the British on their heels, and it was the weather that changed the contest, not their enemy troops. Congress was even elated by the outcome. They stamped out a medal for this defeat and gave it to Washington with this thanks, saying that the thanks of Congress be given to General Washington for his wise and well-concerted attack upon the enemy's army near Germantown on the 4th, and to the officers and soldiers of the army for their brave exertions on that occasion. That's incredible. All right. What about the adversary? Here's a image of a second battalion of light infantry, one of Howe's elite soldiers. Here's what one of their officers writes to a friend a little bit after the battle. Look at this. A most unexpected attack was made on our camp at Germantown by the rebels. This was led on by a chosen band of Virginians. Well, there were more than Virginians in this, obviously, who kept up their fire till within a few yards of our army and rushed down with charged bayonets, which with such impetuosity that our advanced corps was obliged to give way. When this rebellion will end, God only knows, as rebels are much more obstinate and unanimous in their action. In other words, they're showing that there could be more Germantowns in the future coming up against these guys. And what's the difference? How can you replace your losses? Well, for this guy, William Howe, his 550 casualties was nothing to sneeze at, because he has to send for those troops across 3,000 miles of ocean, and those troops have to come to him over 3,000 miles of ocean for all of his battle casualties. So he wasn't happy with the outcome of Germantown. The British stock market dropped when they learned the news of this in early December. So this battle victory for Howe is not perceived that way in London. And for Howe's benefit, he certainly knows that he cannot chase down George Washington again. The easy victories he had against him in this 76 campaign in New York, and even, let's say, earlier in this Philadelphia campaign at Brandywine, aren't likely to be in his future again, but he's concerned that there might be more Germantowns in his. And in fact, if he only knew this, I think he'd be more concerned because this is what Washington is writing on November 1st, 4 days before that battlefield tour I started our little lecture off with. This is what he writes to Congress. This is Washington, remember, who's supposed to be fighting a war of avoidance? Get that out of your mind. Look at this. After the action of the 4th, meaning October, at Germantown, I hoped we would have been in a situation to attack the enemy again on those grounds and with more success than in the former instance, but this I was not able to effect. He will hold 3 more councils in October and November with plans to launch assaults against Germantown. They're all come to naught for various circumstances. But Washington is the opposite of a Fabian. He is the attack dog looking for a way to find an opening in Howe's lines to get at him and perhaps recapture Philadelphia. I think Howe recognizes that. And what Washington doesn't realize is that 2 weeks before his battlefield tour and 2 weeks after the Battle of Germantown on October 22nd, Howe writes a letter to the Secretary of State of the Northern colonies, which are now states. That's Lord George Germain in London. And he writes his letter of resignation. Now, he won't be lifted from command until the following May because, again, the request has to travel 3,000 miles of ocean, get debated on in Parliament. Everything's got to change, come back 3,000 miles. But he is basically a lame duck general for the next 6 months of the war. And a lot of you might have read that Howe resigned because of a guilt he felt when he learned that John Burgoyne surrendered his self and 5,900 of his soldiers to Horatio Gates in the Northern Department at Saratoga, which is being fought almost simultaneously with Germantown. Get that out of your head because Howe will not learn about Burgoyne's surrender until 6 days after he writes the resignation. He doesn't know it. So the surrender of Burgoyne and his army plays no impact whatsoever on Howe's decision to resign. I claim that Washington's obstinance and his aggressiveness is basically showing how this is not going to be a good outcome for me to be staying in place in Philadelphia. And he uses his resignation as a bargaining chip, which doesn't work in his favor. Parliament and Lord George Germain, they all agree to replace him with Henry Clinton. Now, that's the effect that this whole attack had at Germantown. And I think since we just talked about the alliance or the surrender of Burgoyne, we always look at that. Oh, excuse me. I don't know how that got away from me here. We always look at that surrender at Saratoga as the reason for the French alliance, which was signed in February in Paris and then signed by Congress. The treaties of amity and commerce, where French comes in on the side of the U.S. and changes the whole course of the war. We always made that dependent on the Saratoga campaign. But that's a little short-sighted. That's just the Northern Department. Washington has to be looked at as doing well. And John Adams, no greater curmudgeon in the war, found out to his surprise when he goes to Paris in the summer of 77 as a diplomat, he is shocked to learn from them what really influenced their decisions. And he writes this to fellow delegate, Massachusetts delegate James Lovell on July 23rd. General Gates was the ablest negotiator you had in Europe. And next to him, General Washington's attack on the enemy at Germantown. I do not know indeed whether this last affair had not more influence upon the European mind than that of Saratoga. Although the attempt was unsuccessful, how does he finish this off? He says the military gentlemen in Europe considered it as the most decisive proof that America would finally succeed. Adams had learned that Germantown was even more important than Saratoga. Now, you could debate that, but you can't get it out of your mind that outcome made the difference. And who's responsible for that? The guy on the horse right here. This is the cover of my volume 1. I always say this is a Rembrandt Peale. Charles Wilson Peale's artists' sons were all named after famous artists, and Rembrandt Peale drew this image in the 1820s, or painted this image of Washington. It's Washington's anti-Fabian mindset, his aggressiveness at Germantown, that made all the difference, both on the impact on himself, his own confidence, the confidence of his men, the confidence of his subordinate generals, what it did for Congress, what it did to his adversary, what it did in terms of the French alliance. That all had to deal with that aggressive mindset of him. So we could look at Germantown, and we have to, as the tactical defeat of George Washington. In fact, it's his last tactical defeat of the entire Revolutionary War. But in terms of what I've just presented to you, I think we got to look at it this way. It is, without a doubt, the most beneficial defeat in American history. I thank you. I'll stop the share.
Well, thank you so much. I like that final tagline, most beneficial defeat. Are there any questions for our speaker today?
Yeah, Kevin, can you hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, and Gary, I hope you can hear me as well.
I can.
Yeah, good. I think you all can tell from the presentation how fortunate we are to have somebody like Gary join us today. We found him through the Journal of the American Revolution. And I just wanted to note, he mentioned his book. His latest publication is volume 1 of George Washington's Momentous Year. And it's the winner of the 2025 Francis Tavern Museum's Book Award. Very, very impressive. And his second volume is coming out on July 4th, very appropriately, of this year. So he's a prolific author. We are so fortunate to have Gary with us, people of your caliber, Gary. So thank you so much for sharing what I imagine to all of us was a brand new way of looking at Germantown, and what many of us thought of as a defeat. And as you said, it was a tactical defeat, but you shed such an interesting perspective that I had not heard before, and I'm guessing many of us didn't. So thank you so much for joining us and spending your time with us today.
Well, Dick, thank you so much. And thanks for inviting me to speak to your group. And of course, I have enough confidence in this to say, well, that's the way we should all look at Germantown from now on. But here's the point I want to bring up, and I couldn't write this in the book. We will know that Washington will plan a future campaign, the New Jersey campaign in Monmouth, and it's pretty well known in other councils of war that they're looking at the impact of that campaign on the mindset in Europe. And in other words, here's my question, and I'm going to throw out to you folks. And I didn't have enough evidence to write this in the book, but I'm throwing it out there. Was Washington thinking big picture at Germantown? In other words, did he plan that limited attack, hoping to get the outcome of that benefit, whether it was a victory or not, to show that he was always going to be at Howe's, a thorn in Howe's side? Now, remember, in November, let's just say 3 weeks after his battlefield tour, Washington will collect at White Marsh 24,000 officers and men. It is the largest single location field army on the face of the earth. And it's the second largest population center in the United States at White Marsh at that time. And if you're General Howe looking at that army, you're saying, oh, here we go. He's definitely going to be attacking me. And that's exactly what Washington's trying to do with it. But I think he's also trying to impact Europe. I just didn't have any evidence because Washington never admitted to this, but I got to think he had that in his mind when he made the attack the first time.
Yeah.
Any questions with the last couple minutes we have? My answer to you is yes, I think he was probably thinking big picture. It seems to me that there was immense coordination between what was going on in Europe and what was happening on the ground. But like you said, you couldn't find the direct evidence, which is maybe they didn't want anybody to think they were thinking big picture. Any final questions?
Like I said, he's probably also managing a very fickle Congress at this point and just showing that he's putting up, do you believe it?
No.
We're just putting up a fight and on the attack is something that's gonna help him, continue the funding, right? Even though it was scanned at the time, he's battling or he's fighting a battle on many fronts, that being one.
Can you
Not
repeat
just-
what he said? I couldn't quite hear the end of that.
That he was also battling a fight with Congress to get money.
Right.
Just-
Yeah. And the battle will take a more personal view later. Now, Gates's victory, and I'm sure a lot of you know about this, they stamp out that medal for Washington and the thanks. They weren't offering thanks 1 month later because then, and it's only natural to think this way, you look at Gates being successful with battle victories at Saratoga and Washington with defeats, although I'm looking at this one differently, but Congress was saying, wait a minute, Gates is the victor, Washington's always defeated and bothering us for more troops and more money. This is what kind of leads up to what is misnamed, but leads to the Conway Cabal that starts up in the winter of 77, 78. So Congress, many members of Congress are very critical of Washington when they start comparing his Philadelphia campaign, which they don't look as successful, against Gates's campaign in the Northern Department in New York.
It also seemed like, from the quotes, that Washington was trying to improve the morale of the troops. It seemed like the British looked like they were, these elite people, undefeatable, and these actions helped Washington get his troops to be motivated to say, yes, we can defeat these people, we can do this. So I think there was like many different narratives that he was managing here.
Now, Washington will say after the battle, it's an excellent point. And Washington will say after the battle, when he writes, that was one of his reasons for attacking. He flat out says it. That's why I put it in the book. I was trying to be responsible on this, that he was trying to instill some elan into his men. Realize that and a lot of people don't appreciate this. Washington was in his third revamp of the Continental Army in 1777. The average British Army soldier has 7 years of experience. The average Continental soldier in 77 has less than 7 months of experience. And by the time they fight at Brandywine, just 3 weeks before Germantown, most of the Americans that fought at Brandywine were firing their guns for the first time, and 80% of that army had never fired their gun in a battle before. So these are really green troops that before April of 77 were civilians and citizens in towns and cities, and they're now in this brand new army. And when they could see those professional soldiers turn their backs to them to retreat, at least temporarily, at Germantown, it had the effect that George Washington was looking for. So that's exactly why he definitely wanted to instill some elan into those troops, because it was a new army and it needed a little steeling. STEEL, for them to be ready for the next command. What's interesting about it, though, is, back then, of course, with the charge bayonet, there is a report that will come at Valley Forge 6 weeks later called Bayonets Wanting, meaning bayonets missing from the guns. And I brought it back to the troops at Germantown. There are 2,500 missing bayonets. So the guns weren't even fully equipped to launch a bayonet assault at Germantown, yet that's exactly what these soldiers were at least pretending to do in their attack.
Also, thank you for the perspective on Germantown, because it now sort of, it somewhat reminds me of the Doolittle raid in World War II. It's kind of this strike against the enemy that sort of builds mettle within the troops, but also changes the perception for the home front and the people around the world. So very similar.
Yep. And it was planned, and that operation was planned partly for that reason as well. I mean, they knew they discussed the impact that it would have if it was successful, the Doolittle raid. So, like I said, I just can't quite prove that that's what he was attacking at Germantown for, to affect the European mindset, but we know in future campaigns that's exactly what's going on. Volume 2, by the way, is Valley Forge and Monmouth. So those two entities are the bulk of the next volume.
We've got a final question from Dick Hawkins.
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say that I also think that Washington really understood something there that was in the message that the British got. And that is that the British Army had people with enormous experience trained by the best army in the world. He had people with almost no experience taken out of the civilian populace. And the British look at that, and they've got to say, in time, there's no way in hell we're going to be able to stand against these people. And the longer we stay, the worse it's going to be when we finally lose. And so I think he took the heart out of him because he could show what a very untrained army of Americans could do against a very highly trained army that outnumbered them from Britain. And if you're the British top folks looking at that, you can see they're not going to hold this country. They can't hold this country. What Washington showed them in Germantown is you cannot hold this country.
Yes, I would agree with that. In terms of what's the best army in the world, I will say the British Army is the most successful, but I would put the Prussians as a better army in general. They just hadn't fought in they didn't fight in the 7 Years' War, for example. But of course the British Army is the elite army. And by the end of November, when Washington has 24,000 men, he outnumbers Howe in Philadelphia now by about 5,000 men. And when Howe moves up to White Marsh to attack Washington in early December, he could see all of Washington's troops planted on 5 miles of hills. And he went up there with just 15,000 men. What Howe doesn't see is Washington has so many troops that he has a 7-brigade reserve that doesn't even show itself in that contest because he has no place to put them. In other words, he can't even disperse 24,000 men. They just take up too much space. So I always laugh at this notion that that Washington, they say that Washington wasn't really thinking about attacking at Philadelphia. And I think, what are you putting together 24,000 men for, to go into winter encampment with them? Of course not. You're looking at creating the largest army possible to strike when the opportunity is ripe. And Washington actually plans out and starts to launch a Christmas Day attack, trying to repeat Trenton 1 year later, and then that falls apart as well. So that shows up in my next volume. But yes, I think the one most impressed by Washington, although he would never admit it, was probably William Howe. And I will go to my grave thinking that Howe was so affected by Washington at Germantown that did at least factor partly into his resignation. Certainly, Burgoyne's surrender had nothing to do with it. I think Washington's presence had something to do with it.
Well, thank you very much. One more round of applause for Gary.
Thank you, folks.